Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cave of the Cross Apologetics. I am Patrick.
And I'm Tony.
We're in almost towards the end of our book, The Four Views of Christian Ethics, or Christian Ethics, Four Views, from IVP's Spectrum Counterpoint, not Counterpoint, the Spectrum Multi-View series. Don't want to get the branding wrong for that. And we're in the final two responses to John Hare's Divine Command Ethics presentation that he's given. And so the virtue ethicist has already made his case, and he views the presentation as very good, with a few quibbles and one big quibble. Of course, you can go to the last episode to check that one out. And so here we're going to have the natural law response and the prophetic ethics view, figure out what they don't like about God's command, because that's the presentation being made. And so Claire Brown Peterson, who was
wow, that doesn't sound very Christian-like.
Right? You know, that's how we'd spin it in modern YouTube debates, right there. But Claire Brown Peterson is the natural law response, and she also is fairly magnanimous here at the start. And again, always appreciate people who are trying to understand and can kind of give the steelman argumentation and areas of agreement. So she starts off here by saying John Hare's preferred divine command theory involves following three basic commitments. The first one is certain actions can be objectively good or bad, even if God does not command those actions. Two, any action, whether that action be good, bad, or neutral, apart from God's command, becomes obligatory once God commands it, and wrong once God prohibits it. And the third one, no action is obligatory unless God has commanded it, and no action is wrong unless God has prohibited it. So that's her kind of boiled down view of John Hare's divine command particularities, and she's going to tell us kind of which ones she's agreed with and which ones she's going to respond to.
Right. And so, excuse me, she starts out by saying that she'll raise no objections to commitments 1 and 2. How about that? So her problem is going to be with 3. Indeed, she tells us she agrees with 1. And she would put the point in the following way. Jesus commanded his disciples to love one another as he had loved them, but this new commandment did not make such love good. Such love was good even before Jesus commanded it, which is why one need not recognize Jesus' divinity in order to recognize his goodness, and in particular, the goodness manifested in his love for others. So notice what she says here. Goodness existed before Jesus commanded it, right? It was already there. Love as being good, love others as being good was already in existence before God commanded it. And just because Jesus said it, she says, doesn't allow us to recognize Jesus as God just because he gives this kind of command, right? Because it already existed and folks kind of already knew about this, right? And so such love, she says, was good even before Jesus commanded it, which is why we need not recognize Jesus' divinity in order to recognize his goodness, and in particular, how good this command is. She says the divine command theory that Hare has presented can recognize all of this, since it speaks of divine commands as creators of obligation. So the command creates an obligation, but not a creator of goodness, right? Again, because goodness already exists, right? And so as Hare, she tells us, acknowledges the goodness of the action exists prior to God's command that the action be performed. And of course, I think this is a good point, and we have to say this, right? Yes, of course, goodness exists before God commands us to do anything, because it exists in the character and nature of God.
Right,
and so
right.
Clearly that is the case. And I think this is a really good point that she's raising here, that she suggests that she agrees with Hare regarding good is before the command, right? The command kind of makes us obligated with regard to it, and it informs us, but the goodness already exists.
And if you go back and listen to our episode where we covered Peterson's response, her presentation towards the end, she has to agree with this particular point, because that's within the scope of her presentation there.
Right.
All right, so what about commitments 2 and 3? Well, they speak specifically to the relationship between divine commands and obligations. The second one states that whenever God commands a course of action, that action is obligatory. And the third one states that the only actions that are so commanded by God are obligatory. And so she says for the second one that that whatever God commands a course of action is obligatory. She's kind of not going to deal with that one because she doesn't have any objections to that.
Right. It's pretty hard to object to saying that, that God's commands are obligatory, right?
Yeah. What do you mean by this?
I'm going to object to that. Just because God commanded it doesn't mean I'm obligated to do it. So obviously she can't object to that, right? Not and be a believer. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, again, we're talking about Christian ethics here in particular. A larger book would have to come about that applies these things to the scope of the whole world. Which again, I don't think that these people will change their positions of what they are holding to, just kind of the scope of the response.
Yeah, and now she is going to mention this because remember, she's a natural law theorist. And so she's going to say that there are certain things that apply to everybody.
Yes.
Regardless of whether or not God commands them, because that's the nature of who we are. And that's part of our purpose. And that's the basis of her, her morality. Mm-hmm. But we'll see a bit of that in her response here.
Yes. But her primary objection then to divine command theory is concerned with the third commitment. She says, I don't think that commands from God are the only way or even the typical way in which human beings incur moral obligations. So there's something outside of God's commands or prohibitions that are that give people moral obligations. They're a way, but not the only way, or at least not the typical way that humanity incurs those moral obligations.
Right. And notice again, she's going to have to say this because this is her position as a natural law ethicist, right?
Exactly.
That our moral obligations come from more than just God's commands. And so she says, contrary to divine command theory, she holds that we can and often are obligated to behave in specific ways, even if God has not commanded us to act in those ways, right? So she's often heard people speak like this, about discerning what God would or does want or how it would be best for them to behave considering various factors in their life situations, right? But rarely, she says, has she heard someone say that God told her that she must do something, although occasionally she's kind of heard this from people.
Sure.
And so notice she says, if divine command theory is correct, those ordinary people who merely, in scare quotes here, correctly discern that a particular course of action would be the only good moral course of action are not obligated to act in that way that they have seen to be the only good course of action. So notice, if indeed only the commands of God gave us moral obligations or prohibitions with regard to that, right? What about all of these things that we kind of know that are good and we ought to do anyway before we're even presented with commands from God, right? And so that's the point she's raising here. There are things here outside the commands of God that people are aware of and that they do and they know that they're obligated to do. Where does that come from? It's over and above the commands, and that's the point that she is getting at here. And of course, again, she has to say this with regard to her position as a natural law ethicist, right?
Right. So think about either back to your childhood, so many years ago, me, or having children today, and you're commanding them, clean up your room, do your homework, something along those lines. Those are commands. However, a good child, a good you, will know, man, I really should clean up my room. There are certain innate functions of me that should require me to complete my schoolwork before I hop on the Nintendo box and play video games. Or I'm objectively a good student. I'm known to be of good moral and sound kid nature. And so I will almost always clean up my room. In fact, if you see my room uncleaned, then you know that I must be feeling ill or something along those lines. So, that you don't need, her point being, you don't need a command in order to know you should do your homework. The child should clean up the room, and the command is only a kind of you should know. I shouldn't have to tell you this type response.
Right.
Type deal. All right, so the command obedience model of divine-human interaction does not reflect truth about how God sometimes relates to humans and how humans are obligated to behave. But the command obedience model does not capture the whole picture of how humans are designed to function, she says. So in addition to obeying any divine commands we receive, we are also designed to do kind of the following list of things. And of course, she says this won't be a complete list of everything that you must do, because I'm pretty sure there's somebody else that's written a book on that, and and we're supposed to read that book over this one.
And she gives us 5 of these.
Right. So at least the very first one is that we're told to, we know to do the following: of seek out God's will for our own lives by consulting other people and praying for guidance from the Holy Spirit.
So notice how now we can understand what God wants or even what is good without a command is what she's suggesting here, right? We seek out God's will by talking with other people, praying for guidance for the Holy Spirit. We can come to a knowledge of what is the good that we ought to do, and no command is involved in this. So this is the point she's trying to make. Her second one is using our reasoning capacities to evaluate how various courses of actions ought to be carried out. Again, there's no command that's involved here. All we do is reason based on the circumstances, and then that helps us to determine what should be done. Third, use our moral reasoning capacities to consider how Jesus responded to specific circumstances, and then seek to determine what his actions might reveal about what is best for all circumstances. So again, we're kind of, the idea here, we would probably say, is getting principles based on what Jesus did and then using those as guidelines to determine what we should do, right? And again, there's no command involved, is what she's saying in this kind of situation. Fourth, use our moral reasoning capacities to consider counsels or advice that God has given to other people in particular circumstances, and then seek to determine what those counsels might reveal about God's will for all human beings. Again, this is looking at how God has directed other people and given them commands and that sort of thing, not necessarily universal commands, but specific to those people. And then based on that, draw principles about what we ought to do and what we should do. Right. And then finally, fifth, she says, use our moral reasoning capacities to consider commands that God has given to other people in particular circumstances, and then seek to determine what those commands might reveal about God's will for not just us or the person that he's given them to, but to all human beings. And so those 5 things, then, she suggests, are in addition to obeying divine commands that we receive, we also are designed to do these 5 types of things in order to determine what the good is and what we ought to do.
Mm-hmm. Right. So then she goes on to say that one could object that followers of Jesus who have access to the New Testament have been commanded to take responsibility for the needs of their fellow humans.
So notice, this is an objection to the point that she's making. Right? Wait a minute. Jesus has given us a broad kind of command to love. And so all of these things relate to Jesus' broad command to love. And so it is a divine command theory that determines obligations. So that's the objection that she's raising here to her own position.
Right. But Jesus has specifically commanded his followers to love one another as he loved us. And it's quite obvious that such love will involve placing a high premium on ensuring the people's basic needs are met. However, the fact that neither Cain nor anyone prior to Cain was forbidden from committing murder does not mean that Cain's act of murder was bad, but not technically wrong. Right. So we're going all the way back to Genesis and saying before the law, before it was handed down from the tablets of yore, Cain murdering his brother, that was still bad.
Yeah. And notice God never prohibited that. There's no command before Cain murdered his brother that's saying you shouldn't murder your brother, right? And so does that mean then that Cain skates, right?
Right.
You didn't tell me.
Yeah.
I didn't know.
Yeah.
In fact, she goes on to say that.
Right. And so if actual divine commands and prohibitions were required for actions, but right and wrong, or being right and wrong, these conclusions would follow, and we would have to affirm that he needed not to be his brother's keeper.
Yeah, you never told me to be my brother's keeper.
Right. Exactly. There might be a fact that God is coming down and interacting with you, though. Maybe something's up there, but yeah. Right. So there's no tablet of Cain that we know of, at least. However, she goes on saying murder and neglect of one's fellow humans are wrong and can be appreciated as such even before divine prohibitions come along. And so, of course, she's going to insert her model here and say kind of, it's welled up into the human experience or in nature. Cain clearly should know better. And of course, there's a reason he buried his brother, and there's a reason that he lied to God. All these things show a naughty factor to the first murder.
Yeah. So at least we can get Cain there, right? He did do good, or evil. Yeah. Well, she ends this then by saying that while divine commands and prohibitions sometimes create moral obligations, right? Now, that's kind of, are you saying that there are times when commands don't? Maybe. More often, she says, divine commands and prohibitions do not so much create obligations as provide greater clarity about the obligations that existed all along, right? So commands, she suggests, clarifies these various moral obligations, what is good that already existed. Divine commands, she says, often provide unambiguous reminders of these facts that were true all along, but the commands themselves are not required for the facts to be true. And so basically she says, at least in many instances, in fact, as she's implying most instances, we don't need God's command, right? We kind of already know these things. And again, as you mentioned, this is part of her model as well. Right.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So, let's take a generous look at this, and you might scoff at this, but do we honestly believe that without the first tablet of Moses from Mount Sinai, that we need to be told by God to be commanded that he alone is the Lord our God, and that we should worship no one before him? Well, no. I mean that's clearly the case, especially in the story leading up to the mountaintop visit. But the very fact of what was going at the bottom of the mountain shows just how important pointing to something and going, remember rule 1 and 2? Can we at least remember this for 5 minutes, please? Shows kind of more of a purpose, especially, I won't get into the whole factor of this is essentially forming the government between the covenant between God and his people and establishing them as a new nation. That's for a better person to do a better job later. But again, that's something that I think if we take her point, we could find at least some common ground there of agreement. All right, so our final person to kind of lay waste to divine command is Peter Goodwin Hetzel, and he, of course, comes from the Prophetic Ethics response, and so I will just do my best to be somber and present his presentation as best I can. So Hetzel or Goodwin says, why is Anglican philosopher John Hare so invested in commands? Hare argues that the main concern of divine command theory is that we remember to love God's law and God's command. Okay, good. Well, theologies that disregard the Jewish law unveil the problem of Christian supersessionism, an interpretation of the New Testament that sees God's relationship with Christians as replacing God's covenant with the Jews. Christians' replacement theology, the idea that Christianity replaces Judaism, is a heresy that must be continually resisted in Christian ethics. Okay, but I'm not sure why he's going this way, but we might see more. Hare's divine command theory is one strategy to deal with Christian supersessionism.
Right. So he's suggesting here that part of what Hare is attempting to accomplish here is to avoid this replacement theology, this what he calls supersessionism, where, Christianity replaces Judaism. And he's doing that by God's divine command theory. And so, because these various commands, wherever they're found in Scripture, are still required by everybody, both Jews and Christians. And so you don't make this vast separation, this replacement theology. And so he's suggesting that Hare's command theory is a strategy to deal with this Christian, what he calls supersessionism.
Which is odd because I don't remember that being a point that John Hare brings up in his presentation. So this is mighty odd.
Yeah, well, he's aiming at perhaps Hare's motivation, maybe assumed motivation on his part, something like that. Anyway, he says, while affirming God's command as a primary source of ethics, Hare relies more, notice, on Kant of Königsberg than Jesus of Nazareth. He says Hare mentions Kant 30 times and Jesus only once. Shame,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, I'm with him so far.
Yeah. And he says, buried beneath Kant's doctrine. So now he's going to slam Kant, right? Why dare you mention Kant more than Jesus? Because buried beneath Kant's doctrine of dignity is a moral contradiction. What is it? Well, the idea from Kant's perspective is only white men have the capacity for rational autonomy to be full human persons and active moral agents, while Jews, blacks, and women are irrational others who are subhuman, right? He says Kant argues women's propensity is, quote, not to reason, but to sense. I hardly believe that the fair sex is capable of principle. So there it is. Kant is a, misogynist and racist.
Right. I can't believe someone from the Enlightenment period would believes such things. I've never heard of it. Never. Yeah. Well, he goes on to say, historically, within Anglican ethics, the Ten Commandments from one's moral inclinations. The Christian command ethics was problematized through the catechetical instructions of Episcopalian slaves in an antebellum South. So the question, what do you mean by doing no bad things, such things as the devil tempts you to do? Well, for them, the answer is, I mean that I must not hurt anybody, must not disobey my parents, nor disobey my masters, nor disobey God. So we see in the Episcopal Catechism how the analogies between God and master are deployed to offer theological legitimations to the subjugations of slaves, and Christian command ethics conceals colonial violence. So all this has undertones of Kant's racism, backed by the Anglican and Episcopalian view that we need to legitimize the relationships for slaves not to revolt against their masters, and we're going to use the Bible to do such things. And all that should be taken into consideration in divine command, and we should kind of view it with that high level of suspicion.
Right. So notice the divine command theory, according to his perspective, is bad, maybe wrong, whatever, not because of something in and of itself, but because it's related to Kant, right? Kant was bad, and so anything that's related to him seems to be bad. And secondly, it was based on what he calls a concealment of colonial violence, right? So you were using the divine command theory for your own purposes with regard to colonization. And so, not that the theory in itself or that God commands or whatever are good or bad, right or wrong, but that the way they were used is bad, and who came up with a certain kind of theory with regard to commands, that person is bad, and therefore since they were being used for bad purposes and then they were argued by a bad person, then the theory is bad. And so, I'm not sure if we want to go there with regard to our criticisms, right? I mean, it sounds like a little ad hominem type of attacks there.
Yeah. Well, all we need to do is just wait 20 years, and then we'll figure out what sins Goodwin has committed, and not have to read him anymore.
Right. Now, the way he ends it, though, I think is notice what he says here. He
Right.
says, "Our call as humans is not primarily to love God's law and love God's command, but to love our living God through a personal I-thou relationship." Right. So that's it. And I think we can get on board with that, at least to a certain extent. Right. Clearly, God's part of our responsibility is to obey God's command. But Jesus says, "I never knew you," to those who thought they were doing what they believed was right. And so it's a relationship, right? And so clearly that's it. Now, I think he references Martin Buber here with regard to this I-thou relationship, and I'm not sure we want to look at that.
Problematic.
Right.
Is what it
But
is.
the issue here is relationship, right? And I think he hits on something there. He says, like God who heard Israel crying out because of their slave drivers, Exodus 3:7, we need to open our hearts to hear the cry of the suffering others. And that's what he's suggesting is the source of our moral obligation. The loving others, loving God, having a relationship with God. And as a result of having that relationship and loving God, we love others and attempt to deal with their suffering. And so that's kind of how he ends his particular criticism here.
Right. So, yes. So there we go. Again, we don't present everything to you from the chapters, and we kind of hit the main points of what we think are there. So pick up the book. Links are in the description. But for next time, we'll actually cover the new challenger to the ring, which is the prophetic ethics viewpoint, and see how we can be ethical under the system as Christians from that standpoint. And I don't know, maybe I have to be silent and let Tony take the entirety of that chapter. So I don't know.
No, you're not going to get away with that.
Gonna make me read it. Okay, I guess I'll read it, and I'll give the colonial perspective response. Well, again, you can check out all the short clips and everything like that on YouTube. Actually, I don't think they're on Rumble because it takes a lot to upload on Rumble, but at least on YouTube. And from there, you can kind of hit the main points of the full episode if you don't want to sit down and invest in a half an hour. We put all these out, and I think they're good little touch points too for discussion as well. Always, you can go to caveofthecross.com for all the other books that we've done, and some have been just excellent, and a lot of them I still refer to even in my own teachings or homeschooling, and so I'm happy about the books we picked, and even the ones parts that I disagree with. I still find that I have to make comments about that. So. Maybe that's what we'll get from here, or I could just slag the author and not have to deal with any of the argumentation. So, so of course, join us next time as we finish up almost the end of our book here with the final perspective on Christian ethics. So, as always, we thank you for joining us, and see you next time.
See you next time.